layer in your system. Install this SAP GUI. Once you install this SAP GUI, you'll be able to connect to the application server of the server. So, for example, to open a website, I would need this web browser, right? So, what is the role of this web browser in my system now? For example, if I'm searching for something, this web browser, is it compiling this? Is it doing anything here? When I give a search query and click on search, is the web browser processing this request? No, right? It's simply connecting to the Google server. Whatever information I type in this window is sent to the Google server. The Google server has processed this request and it has sent back some result to me. It has sent me all this information, right? And my web browser is simply presenting that data in a user-friendly way. Without this web browser, the information the Google server has sent would look something like this, which I may not be able to understand, right? Which we cannot interpret. So the role of the web browser is it won't process anything in your system locally, right? Whatever you input, it will simply send that request to the web server. The web server will actually process the request and then it will send back some result which my web browser will present in a user-friendly way. Now this web browser takes inputs, right? So if these are the search results, Google is kind enough to send my website. So if I click on this, now again my web browser is sending a request here, which this web server has processed and it has sent back some result which is presented to me. So this web browser takes inputs from the users, it reacts to the user clicks, right? The same way, like you need a web browser to connect to a web server or open a website, you need this GUI to connect to your SAP system or open any applications in the SAP system. So in any system where you install this SAP GUI, it becomes the presentation layer. So any system which has this SAP GUI, we call it a presentation server, or it becomes the presentation layer. So to connect to this server, all you need to do is install this GUI. It's a 400-500 MB file, download it and install it, and your system becomes a presentation layer. So the application, the SAP GUI accepts inputs from the user and sends this request to the application server for processing. So when you execute a program, right now if I execute this program, nothing is getting executed locally in my system. This GUI is simply taking my request and sending that to the application server. The application server is processing the request and it is sending back the result which I'm seeing on my screen, right? So nothing is getting executed locally in my system. That's why my system need not be a very high-end configured system, because from my system I'm just sending the request and receiving some result, right? For that you don't need to have a high-end configuration. The application server which is processing the request should be a high-end configured server, right? It should have good processor, good memory and all these things. But the user workstation need not be high-end. Any basic system is sufficient. So SAP GUI accepts inputs from the user and sends this request to the application server for processing. The application server sends the results back to the SAP GUI, which formats the output for display. So that's what exactly this GUI is doing. If I give this command here, if I send this request, then the application server, this GUI has sent this request to the application server, which has sent me this result which my GUI is presenting. Now if I select something here and click on this button, again a request will be sent to the application server, which my application server will process, and again it has send me back this particular window. Now again I can select this, and so my GUI is simply taking the request from me, sending it to the application server, and whatever application server returns, it is presenting it to me again. So that's your presentation layer. So any system on which you install this SAP GUI becomes your presentation layer. So we have three types of GUI available based on the system you are using. If you are using a Windows PC, you can install this GUI for Windows environment. If you are using a Mac PC, for example, you can install this GUI for Java environment. Or if you simply want to use a web browser to connect to the application server, then you can use this GUI for HTML, web GUI. So we have these three types of GUI available. So based on your operating system, you can install that type of GUI. But with GUI for Java and GUI for HTML, there are quite a few limitations on what you can do. So as a developer, the developing tools which we'll be using, the applications which we'll be using to develop these applications in SAP, we call it the ABAP workbench tools. These are not very well supported in GUI for Java and HTML. So mostly we'll be using the GUI for Windows environment. So for example, if I try to open this transaction MM01, for example, to create a material, I'm typing MM01 and it opens this transaction, right? So for this transaction, if I open this MM01, for this transaction, we need to maintain which GUI is supported. Okay. By default, everything is supported in Windows. So if you want support for HTML, you select this. If you want it to support for Java environment, you can select this. And if you want to support all three, select 3 so that this transaction will be supported in all the types of GUI. So here you can see the presentation layer. We have different types of GUI. We have GUI for Windows. We have the terminal server. We have the Java environment, and here we have the web GUI, right? So if you want to use a web browser to connect to your SAP system, then in the application layer we should have something called ICM. Without that, you won't be able to connect to the server using your web browser. So we'll talk about this application layer next. Then you'll understand what is this dispatcher and ICM that you see on the screen. So this is about your presentation layer. It's simply one file which you install in your system and your system becomes the presentation layer. And we have different types of GUI available based on the operating system you have installed on your laptop or desktop. So application layer. This is important for you to understand application layer because whatever programs you develop, when the user executes your program, the programs are executed in the application layer. They are not executed locally in the user's workstation. So all the programs run in the application server. So it's important that you understand what exactly happens in the application server, how your program is processed, so that you have a better understanding of when you develop your program, you have a better understanding what happens when the user clicks on any of the buttons that you are providing. So the application layer is where an ABAP program carries out its work. The application layer of an RT system is made up of application servers and the message server. So in the application layer, we have the application servers and we also have something called a message server. Now what is this message server? For example, let's say right now in your company, you have 100 users. So your user base is 100. And anyone who logs into the SAP system will be connected to this application server, right? So you have installed this SAP GUI in all the 100 workstations, and whichever user logs into the SAP system will be connected to the application server. Now this application server also has some limitation on how much load it can take, right, based on the hardware used in the application server. For example, if you have 4 GB memory in the application server, let's say it can take a load of 50 users at a time, because every user who's connecting to the application server or who's logged into the system occupies some memory in the application server. So this application server will also have a limitation on how much load it can take, right? So let's say you have one application server in your landscape and you have 100 users, so your one application server can take the load of 100 users, right? So all the users will be connected to this application server. Now tomorrow, if your user base increases, you have 100 more employees joining your company, but the current application server you have can take the load of only 100 users. So what happens to the other 100? Will you be implementing another SAP system for them? No. You can simply add one more application server in the landscape. In the application layer, you can have one more application server, so that the first 100 users will be connected to application server 1 and the remaining 100 can be connected to application server 2. Here if you see, here we have 4 different application servers in the landscape. So based on your user base, if your user base increases, you can simply add one more application server to take care of that extra load, right? So when you have more than one application server, there should be a way for these application servers to communicate with each other, right? So for example, let's say I'm a user, I'm connected to, when I logged into the system, let's say in our landscape, we have 2 application servers. I've logged into the system, so let's assume I'm connected to application server 1. In this application server, I'm trying to edit this document. So I've opened this invoice for editing to add a few more item details or to edit this document. Now, at the same time, if somebody else tries to open the same document for editing, it throws an error saying that this document is currently being processed. So no 2 people should be able to edit the same document at once, right? Once I complete my editing, you can open that and edit if you want, but 2 people cannot edit the same document at the same time. So there should be some logical locking functionality provided when you develop your applications. Now let's assume in a scenario where I'm connected to application server 1 and I've opened this document for editing in application server 1, and another user is connected to application server 2 and he's trying to open the same document in application server 2 for editing. Now, if somebody else tries to open the same document in application server 1, the server would be aware that somebody else is already processing, so it can lock the user. But the second user has opened this document in application server 2. Now how will the application server 2 know that somebody has already opened this document for editing in application server 1? Right? So there should be a way where these application servers can communicate with each other, so that the moment I try to open a document, this application server can check with all the other application servers if this document is opened anywhere. If it's not opened, it can let me open it for editing. Otherwise, if it's open anywhere else, it can throw an error saying that this is currently being processed. Right? So there should be a way these application servers should communicate with each other. Now, that is where this message server comes into picture. So in the application layer, we have the application servers and the message server. The role of the message server is to help these application servers to communicate with each other. So the application servers communicate through the message server, and also this message server takes care of load balancing. That means when you log into the system, you won't be connected to this application server directly. You'll be connected to the message server. The message server will see which application server can take the load, and then it will connect you to that application server. For example, we have 2 systems in the landscape, 2 application servers. When I log in, I'll be connected to the message server, and the message server will see that application server 1 is having 70% load, but application server 2 is having only 10% load. Then it can connect me to application server 2 instead of connecting me to application server 1, because application server 2 is having less load. So this message server does the load balancing part also. So the application layer of an RT system is made up of application servers and the message server. Message server is responsible for communication between application servers. So it helps the application servers to communicate with each other. Application server exists to interpret ABAP programs, right? So all your ABAP programs run in the application server. So the application server is the one which interprets your code, whatever code you write, it interprets that code and performs those tasks. Programs run only in the application server, not in the presentation server. So remember this, when you execute a program, when I'm executing these programs, all these programs are running in the application server, not in my system locally. Any questions on this application layer? Arjun? Arjun, you have a question? Please type your question. I don't think